to do some stuff in a place called Toronto. I had never been east of Winnipeg. I shouldn't say that, I lie. I had been east of Winnipeg, about 120 miles down to the, it was just about to the Ontario border, not quite. And, but that was it. And I shouldn't say that. I'd been to Ottawa and back, and I'd just done a course that we had, but flew in, flew out. But never really spent any time back east. So I had no clue what was here. And all I thought was, I'm going to fly a desk. I'm going to be a trainer. I loved the street. I was, you know, when you get to be out of the uniform and you start doing, the drug thing was big in those days. And all of a sudden we got Fu Manchu mustaches and I don't have to wear a uniform anymore. And you're chasing the bad guys. And everything was, like everything was perfect in my life. And all of a sudden now you're being transferred to train young guys or do something, and I didn't know anything about that. So that's what's really got me going to thinking. I was sitting there with Gus one day, and, yeah, you should get in the business. Yeah, sure. What am I going to know about this? And that's how it started. That just started the little spark in there. And then I started to look at, maybe that's where my father's intuition of stuff of where you made money. You looked at businesses that made money, because he used to say, get out of this small town, there's nothing here. Go west or go east, wherever, but get out of here. I started looking how many people were coming through that door. On a Friday night, they'd be lined up. The guys would be making pizza there till 4 in the morning. And I look around, the average age was my age, which at that time was about 25 and under. And most of them were 18, 19, going to the University of Alberta, or they're going to high schools or whatever from a dance. And that's what hit me is, there was no credit cards. They didn't take credit cards in those days. It was all cash, and they had a drawer. And I remember sitting after on the floor with them, counting money and putting them in stacks of 5s and 10s and very little coins. But, you know, it was amazing to see that, and you think, maybe there's a chance. Now, the hard part with this is they never told us anything about what was going on. So when Don and Don said to me one day, he said, you know, I think we could do well at this. But he was the guy that probably knew them. He knew the guys longer than I did. But he never ever, bless you, he never ever wanted to take the chance. It was me that said, let's go and try it. Let's do it. And then I had to go home and tell my wife. That was the first one, and I had no money. So that was the second thing, but we figured we'll get that going. So I went home that night, and of course in those days, and the guys will appreciate this, they're a little about the age of around my age, is you never told your wife anything until you were moving. And I went home and I said, my wife was a nurse at the time, and I walked in and I said, I got a chance to go into Boston Pizza, and I think we're going to take it, and we're going to move to Penticton.
Yeah, that wouldn't fly today.
Yeah. And she said, well, when? And I said, I'm probably leaving in 2 weeks. And I've got to get out of the outfit, and we do all this stuff. And she said, well, but you know, we had trouble with our checks and stuff. You know, we got rent, and well, I said, your check at the hospital will cover that. I got to be out of here and be able to buy some equipment. And she said, well, where are you going to get the money? I said, well, I get my pension money from the RCMP, which turned out to be $5,250. I'm a little short. So, where do you go? Back home. So I actually had my uncle that was in the police force. He had left and got in the trucking business, and I got a ride in the back of on the semi-trailer truck. I went up in the sleeper and went all the way down to my hometown in the back of a truck. Got there, got out at the station, the Anglo station, and my mother came and picked me up and drove me home. And she said, how's everything going? I said, oh, just great. And she said, I said, I got to have a meeting with Dad. And she said, we started talking about it. I think she was thinking I was going to buy a house. So, and that's still resonates in my mind, but I don't know what she was thinking. But anyway, I walked in the house and I said, I want to talk to Dad about some money. And of course, that ends her conversation. She moves out of the room and he comes in, because we never talked about money in front of my mother. So he sat in what we called the den. It was a little piece off our living room. And I walked in there and he says, so what's going on? So I described the story. I said, I've ran into these guys, I got a good partner, and we're going into business, and I'm going into, you know, I met these Greek guys, and we got this place, we're opening a restaurant.
Oh yeah, and I'm leaving the police force.
And he looks at me first, and he said, you're opening a what? I said, a restaurant. Well, I said, actually it isn't. It's a restaurant, Dad, but it's a pizza place, a Boston. Pizza? I said, no, pizza. Pizza, what is it? And I said, it's a pizza. He had no clue, like I did, about what I'm even talking about. And of course, then he turns to me and he said, so what do you want? And I said, well, I need a hand. And he said, let me think. You need a hand. Yeah? You're going into the pizza business with a bunch of Greeks selling Italian food in Penticton, British Columbia, where it's a semi-retirement area, or retirement area. We used to have a sign out there, or a thing in Penticton that used to say there's the nearly deads and the dead, So you can imagine when you retired and went to Penticton. So I'm moving there. He said, no, you don't need a hand, you need a psychiatrist. He said, how long, and I had told him I'd left the police force, and he said, can you get the job back? I said, no, I'm not going back. And that was the stubbornness part that came probably from his side of the family. And I said, I'm not going back, but I need that. And I thought, and he just got up and walked out of the room. That was it. I'm sitting in the room, Mom comes in, and of course, what do? You're a big guy. I walk in, I said, now think about this. I've been involved in murders. I've been working the streets in Prince George. I've been a tough guy. And this little lady comes in about 5'2", and I said, Mom, I need a hand. You got to talk to him. He just walked out of the room. He didn't even give me an answer. He just walked out. And she said, well, your dad. I said, he's gone to bed. And I said, can you go and just go up and talk to him? She said, well, I'm going to bed too, but he'll be asleep by the time I get there. So walk in the room. Next morning, he got up every morning at 6:30, put on a shirt and tie, and went to the barber shop. He made his breakfast. He used to get up and he'd put the coffee on. Mom would make breakfast, and he'd walk out that door at 7. You could set your watch on at 7:15, 7:30. And he walked up to the barber shop, which was, we lived about 2 blocks up the road. So I'm sitting at the kitchen table. I'm devastated. I don't know where I'm going to get $5,000 more. I needed $5,000. And she turned around and I said, what do you think? And she said, he got up. Jim, we don't talk about that. You know that. He doesn't talk about business. I said, Mom, it's not business. It's just $5,000 I'm talking about. But it was like $1 million. The phone rang as we were sitting there talking. I picked the phone up. Her mother picked it up, and she handed it to me. She said, your father. And I handed it. He said, I want you to go up to the bank and see Dumbleton. He's the manager, and he was a good friend of my mom and dad's. And Fred and his mother, I knew his name was Fred, but I never called him Fred. It was Mr. Dumbleton to me. And the same with his wife was Mary. I never knew Mrs. Dumbleton's name was Mary. It was Mrs. Dumbleton to me. But anyway, they've been friends for years. And I walked up there, and now think about this. I've been in tough, tough towns. My palms are sweating. I got beads coming under here, and I'm sitting across from a gentleman that was probably my age now, with his glasses over here in Virden, Manitoba, and he's probably retiring about 6 months after I seen him. And he looks over his glasses, and he read the riot act to me. You got a loan. I'm giving you a loan for $5,000. Don't you ever miss a payment. It's $215 or $252.15 a month, and I tell you right now, you miss a payment and you're out of business. And my heart's going boom, 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 boom. And I'm thinking, why am I scared of this old guy sitting across from me? But I looked over and he's got the draft sitting there. So I reached over and picked the draft up and put it in my pocket. It was for $5,000. What I found out 2.5 years later, that there was no loan. My dad had actually paid the loan that day.
That's a great story.
But it made me 2 things. The things that it really made me do is I never missed a payment. Trust me, I never missed a payment, that $200 and some. I wouldn't eat that week if I didn't miss that payment. But it was 2.5 almost. There was about a year left in the payments, and that's when I got the phone call. There hadn't been a loan because he had left the bank, and this bank manager phoned and said, "Why you send this money back here?" I had no clue. But that was, the first experience. And again, when you look at people that come on, I see in the Dragon's Den, when they walk out there, that's the feeling I had when I walked out in front of the banker and my dad. I had to pitch them. Now, the biggest pitch came for me years after that, when we got into the business, and like I say, we were 2 years into it and probably broke and didn't know it. And that's when I started looking to how do I take it to the next level. I wasn't going back. My partner and I, who was a policeman, Don Spence was his name, and Don and I shared a car together. We went back and forth. When I came to work, he went home with a car, and vice versa. And we grew the business to a small level. We thought we'd just get 1 or 2, one restaurant for him and 1 restaurant for me. And that was it. And then we started, I'm pounding pizza every day. I think, this is crazy. If I can get everybody to do this, and I can go and bid another one. So our second store we opened, it was in Prince George. Surprise, surprise. Don didn't never been there, and he said, what are you doing? And I said, it's the greatest town. Remember, sure we fought every night of the week up there, and sure we did all these crazy things up there, and it was a tough town. But you know what? There was 4 pulp mills, and the place was lousy with money. When we opened our first store, or the second store up there, we were lined up till 4 and 5. In fact, I walked in the dining room one day and said, haven't any of you people got a home to go to? Because it's 5 o'clock in the morning, you're still ordering pizza. And we had to go home because we ran out of everything. It was so busy. So that was our first experience of really going. And then where it really came to fruition for us is both Don and I had opened the third store. We went out to Prince Rupert to take 2 days off to go fishing. As we're pulling into town, into the city of Prince Rupert, which was about, it's about a 4-hour drive across, 5-hour drive across from Prince Rupert in those days, or to Prince George, Prince Rupert. It's on the coast. And when I got there, there was a sign in the building that said, phone this number for lease. I phoned the number, and the guy came back in and he said, he gets on the phone, and I don't know if you remember this, but there was a lady by the name of Grace McCarthy who was the tourism minister under the Bill Bennett government. It was her husband that owned the building. And he answered the phone, and he said, I'm flying from Whitehorse. Can I meet you and we'll sign the lease tonight? And I said, well, I just got to Prince Rupert. And he said, I think there's a bus at midnight you can catch. So I rode the bus all the way back and never did go fishing. We were only there for 4 hours. Caught the bus back to Prince George and signed the lease at the airport. And that was how we built our third store. On the fourth store and the fifth store, I ended up taking all my stuff to an accountant from a company called Pete Marwick Mitchell, became KPMG. And that's where I met my partner, the present partner I have today, who will be my partner for 39 years. And we bought my original partner out just before we bought Boston Pizza. And so that was the first turn, and George was the accountant. And he was the first one to sit down with me and say, you know, you guys have worked hard, and you've really done well, but you're not going to be around next year if you don't do certain things. And one of them is you're going to have to get all your stuff in line. And I asked him if he wanted to come with us, and he said no. He said, I'll do your books, but I'll get you a bookkeeper. And he did that for 1.5 years, and then every year I'd asked him to come with us to be our accountant. On the 5th year that I'd been in business, I went to see George, and I said, listen, we're going to build some more of these stores. Why don't you come with me as a partner? We'll try you out for 1 year and see how it works. See if you're happy with us. We did. He had to go home and tell his dad. And his dad was the bank manager at that time, had just retired. So now George has got the same problem I had. I said, good luck, see you later. And he said, aren't you coming? I said, no, you're on your own. So he went and told his father, and the next thing we knew, we became partners. And to this day, we're still partners, and he lives in Vancouver, and there's a great person. There's
an interesting note in here, I find, that by Expo 86,
yes.
And not to torture this metaphor too far, but I was there too. It was my first intern job after finishing journalism school, that you were already successful by many standards.
Sure, we never met somewhere before?
We may have. I probably bought pizza
hit all the same towns, but you'd be, what were you, about 10 when the line was around there?
No, thank you. But interesting that you were successful by many standards, but that actually ended up being a really critical time for your business.
Yes.
Because you were also dealing with elements that were well beyond your control. The rain, for instance. Well,
Expo was, I don't know if you remember, Expo 86 was the biggest thing. BC was in one of the biggest recessions it had ever been in. Sawmills, there were laborers marching in the streets. Bill Bennett was the premier of the province at that time, and the unions had really got tough on what was going on because they were being laid off all over the country. Nobody was buying lumber, and it was just a mess. They were building a highway that was now called the Coquihalla Highway, which was from Vancouver all the way out to the Okanagan Valley. And they were putting projects to work like similar to what's happening in the US, where they're doing some stuff to try and get people back to work. And all of a sudden this World's Fair come up. And we were asked to go in it because we were a British Columbia company at that time. And we were the biggest guys there. And we had just bought Boston Pizza from the people in Edmonton. And so we just moved it in, and I'd gone and pitched to buy this company in 1983. And I didn't have the money to do it, but we had all the hard work, and we had George as my partner, and the two of us said, and the owner at the time was a guy by the name of Ron Coyle out of Edmonton. He had bought it from the Greek family. And Gus and his brother were still in some of the stores. So we're driving down the street one day. This is just before Expo. And I picked Ron up at the airport, and we were heading down to the Four Seasons Hotel to drop him off. And a friend of his, we're having lunch. And on the way down, he said, you know, this business is driving me nuts. And he was an ex-banker. And he said, why don't you guys buy it? And I think he did it as an offhanded remark. Well, I said, yeah, we'll buy it. And he said, what? I said, we'll buy it. And on the road from the Vancouver airport to downtown was about a 20-minute drive. We made the deal in the car. So we got out of the car, he got out, and I get him out, and I got his luggage out, and I'm excited. And George, who is my partner and from KPMG, is a very astute guy and never said much. And when he stepped out of the car, he turned to me and he said, did you just tell him we're buying Boston Pizza? And I said, yeah. He said, where are we getting the money? I said, he didn't ask us that. He just wanted to know we're buying the company. And he said, you said yeah. And I said, yeah. And he said, okay. So what we did is went back to the office and we sat down, and he and I said, I'm gonna put a list of 5 people I know. I better make 10 because maybe 5 of the guys I know probably don't have any money. So let's make it 10. And I'm going to hit every one of these guys. And the first one I hit was a friend of mine that I coached his son in hockey, and my son was on the same hockey team. And I went to him, and they owned the Richmond Inn Hotel. I thought he owned it all. And he had a partner. And he was an accountant. So I walked in, I said to Dave Gillespie was his name, I said, Dave, I got to meet you for lunch. And he said, what's going on? I said, I got a chance to buy Boston Pizza. And I said, it basically was in BC and Alberta at that time. And there was 1 store in Saskatchewan, or 2 in Saskatchewan and 2 in Manitoba. And he looked at me, he said, is it a good business? And I said, yeah, and this is on the phone. So I said, listen, I'm coming over at 2 o'clock. You finish your lunch. We'll meet your office, and I'll see you. I turned to George, and this was about 10 o'clock in the morning. I said, George, do a 5-year plan up. You're an accountant. You do a 5-year plan up. Say what we're going to have for a salary. This is what we're going to do, and look at these numbers. And he did it. We did a projection in for 5 years based on the stores we knew of at that time. And I said, now, you have the presentation. I'll do the talking. So we walked in the room, sat down with him, and I said, Dave, this is a hell of a deal. We could get, I'm not supposed to swear. This is a great deal. And what we're going to do is we're going to build this thing up, and we got a chance to do this and do this and do this. He looked at me, he said, you know, I only own 20% of this business. I have to bring my other partner in from Calgary. I said, sure. But he said, let me have a look at the numbers. So George presented the numbers. In 25 minutes, we had a 25-minute pitch. We walked out the door and did a high five because he said, yeah, this looks like a deal for us.
And for how much money?
At that point, it was $3 million. 3.5 actually. I'd actually took Ron down. He wanted 4. I told him 3, and he said 3.5.
That's a pretty good pitch. It
didn't matter what the number was. That was a good pitch. So we walked out of there, and as we walked out of the place, he phoned Bud, and Bud came out, who was a really great guy, and he was Dave's partner. He was the guy that owned 5 hotels. He walked in the next morning, and he said to us, the only questions he asked me, he said, you're in the RCMP? I said, yeah. He said, you honest? And I said, yeah. Good. Shook hands and went. And he said, I got to use the washroom. We walked out and went back on the plane to Calgary. And Dave sat down and opened their checkbook up, and he wrote out the check. And he said, what do you think it's going to take to get started, just to get all the stuff done? And I was going to say 50 grand, and I thought, I'm not going to say that much. And George said 100. And I thought he's going to kill the deal right there. Anyway, we got the first 100,000, and the rest is history. We bought the company, and in fact, they could have wrote the whole check for 3.5. I actually went back to the guys in Edmonton and said, we can raise this money, and we got a partner, and you're going to carry us, and we're going to pay you an interest rate. So we actually paid it off over 5 years. We didn't have to pay it all up front.
I think for people who watch programs like Dragon's Den or read a book written by someone who's been as successful as you've been, they're asking themselves, especially if they're contemplating going into business or are currently in business, where is that line between genius and the pitch that in 25 minutes nets you what you need to make a go of it, and foolishness? Putting yourself too far over the line, committing to something you can't make work. How did you know?
Well, I think the greatest thing, Dan, was I had taken George on as a partner. If I hadn't had him in the room at that time, it wouldn't have flown. This deal would not have flown at all.
So
because
is it about
I was looking
choosing
for
a good partner?
He looked at me and said, you know the business side, you've done all this projections of what you do. you've got the enthusiasm and the passion. That was me. I'm on the way to the moon. George used to say, you're on the way to the moon. You know, I'm just getting out of the stratosphere right now. So let's back off a little bit. So he was the one that was very analytical. I was the guy that said, no fear. What fear did I have? What was the worst thing that could happen to me? I'd lose the business, I guess, but I had nothing into it. I had time and effort. And when I looked at it, I didn't like taking on anything that I couldn't go and get my hands wet or feet wet or whatever and get into it. I was not afraid of work. And I've often said this to kids I talk to now. If you're not afraid of work, there should be no fear of doing anything. That's the hardest thing for all of us. My dad had a fear of coming through the 30s. And I remember him turning back to me and saying, you know, you don't have any clue what it was like to have no meal, not have a meal, but porridge for 5 days. Or you make, you know, we didn't have the money to do this. You couldn't borrow anything. That's why he didn't say anything. He wasn't a big fan of the banks at that time, because nobody was a fan of the banks, right? So in that era, they had to be tough just to live. I think I got that instilled in me as a very young man, and that's why the fear left me. And I didn't have the fear of going broke. I didn't know. We were broke in the first 2 years, and I didn't know it, because I just went to work every day. I remember getting to the point my partner walked in one day and threw the keys at me. And you read it in the book that, I mean, I thought it was over, or he thought it was over. I didn't. I never had that feeling. I'm trying to dream where I can get another 4 or 5 grand just to get through the weekend so we could get to the next level. And all of a sudden that happened. A friend of mine walked in. I changed the pop machine. Didn't have to pay him for 90 days. I had 15 grand to work with. I thought I'd win the lottery.